welcome back to my channel. Today we're focusing on food contamination and food spoilage. So the lesson objectives are simple. You must be able to identify ways in which food contamination can be prevented, describe the 3 classifications of foodborne illnesses, and differentiate between perishable and non-perishable foods. So first, before we get into the definition of food contamination, I want you to take a look at the images being displayed. Do these food items look safe for consumption, or do you think these ingredients could be used on a normal day-to-day basis in recipes? The obvious answer here is no, and this is because contamination defines the presence of substances or the conditions in food that can be harmful to humans if it is consumed. Let's move on to contaminants. Now, the contaminant would be any substance which makes the food unsafe for us to consume. And these fall into 3 main types. So the first one is biological, the second one being chemical, and the third one being physical contaminants. The biological contaminants or biological hazards are the most common types that are responsible for food spoilage or foodborne illnesses, right? They would include things such as bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungi, and they are commonly associated with raw food products, humans, and live animals. Another thing to note also is that biological contaminants or biological hazards are microscopic, and this means that it is hard for us to see it with the naked eye. Moving on to chemical contaminants or chemical hazards. Now, as the name suggests, these are toxic substances that may occur naturally or may be added during food processing. And these would include things such as pesticides, fertilizers, heavy metals, and food additives. How can one mistake chemicals when preparing food items? Now, sometimes simple errors or simple mistakes can cause contamination by chemical substances. Let's say, for example, there are bottles in the kitchen or food preparation area that are not properly labeled. Someone can mistake a chemical for a common food ingredient, and then this can cause the food to go bad. And then the final type of contaminant would be physical contaminants. And these would refer to any foreign object, whether hard or soft, that are found in food and can cause illness and injury. So, common items would include things such as glass chips, metal shavings, bits of wood, human hair. These are all typical examples. And they are introduced into the food accidentally and by poor food handling practices. In the comments below, I want you to share if you've ever had any food item and you found a physical contaminant. So now that we've looked at the types of contaminants, we're going to look at the ways in which food can become contaminated. Now, it can occur in 2 ways. It can be direct contamination or it can be cross-contamination. Direct contamination would mean that the raw food or the plant or animal would become contaminated from the area which they come, from the source. And then cross-contamination would be the transfer of any contaminant, whether chemical, biological, or physical, while processing, preparing, or serving food. Direct contamination would mean contamination of the food item from its source. And cross-contamination would mean the transfer of any contaminant either while processing, while preparing, or serving food. Alright, so cross-contamination is pretty common during food preparation, so we're going to look at some ways in which it can be prevented. So the first one is you want to ensure that when you are purchasing prepared foods that you minimize handling and reduce the transfer of pathogens from one surface or from one food to another. Next, you want to ensure that you are working in a clean and sanitized area. Use separate equipment and remind employees to wash hands after touching anything that may be contaminated. This can be applied to home or domestic use as well. Next, food service organizations should have good personal hygiene programs in place. So let's apply this to ourselves, either while we're working at home or while we're working at school. Want to ensure that if you are using equipment that you wash after each use. Want to ensure that you wash your hands, especially after you would have touched raw meat, raw seafood, or poultry. And then you also want to ensure that you are practicing good personal hygiene. That way you're not risking the food becoming contaminated. Alright, so now we can move on to the classifications of foodborne illnesses. Now, the illnesses can be classified into 3 types. So it's either foodborne infection, foodborne intoxication, or toxin-mediated infection. And it is important to note that these illnesses are caused by food becoming contaminated by a microorganism. So the first one, food infection, this is caused by eating food that contains living disease-causing microorganisms. Food intoxication is caused by eating food that contains harmful chemical or toxins produced by bacteria and other sources. Toxin-mediated infection is caused by eating food that contains harmful microorganisms that then in turn produce a toxin once it is inside the human intestinal tract. Alright, so just to recap, we said that there are 3 classifications. Infection, which is caused by eating food that contains microorganisms. Intoxication is caused by eating foods that contain harmful chemicals or toxin that would have been produced by microorganisms. And then toxin-mediated infection is caused by eating food that contains harmful microorganisms that then in turn produce a toxin, but it occurs inside the human intestinal tract. So how can we prevent food contamination? Now we can do this by using food thermometers for testing the temperature when storing, cooking, holding, or serving food. Want to ensure that you keep food out of the temperature danger zone. And for those of you that don't know, the temperature danger zone would range from the temperatures of 40 degrees Fahrenheit and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature or within these 2 temperatures, food can cause illness. Next, you want to ensure that you observe hygiene and safety practices when selecting, purchasing, handling, and storing food. And then, of course, another honorable mention is to avoid cross-contamination, and you can do this by separating food items, and you can also do this by separating utensils and equipment being used. Selecting and purchasing food. So these are some tips or guidelines that you can follow when selecting and purchasing food. So you want to inspect the food for quality and quantity, and expiry dates where applicable before purchasing. Buy foods from markets or shops that are clean and in good sanitary condition. Select fresh produce that is clean, firm, and free from blemishes, bruises, and sprouts. Buy foods in packages that are clean, sound, properly labeled, mold-free, and in cans that are not rusty, dented, or swollen. And then you want to buy frozen foods that are solid and have their original bright color and no offensive odors. Now we're going to move on to perishable foods. So what are perishable foods? Now these foods are usually fresh foods. Sometimes they may require refrigeration or to be stored in a cool place in order to increase the shelf life of the product. Now this group would include things such as fresh bread, soft cheeses, milk, meats, eggs, vegetables, fruits, and frozen foods. For frozen foods, it should be mindful that they should be kept frozen until they are used. And if they are to be thawed, they must be used immediately. And then you want to try to avoid refreezing foods. And this is to ensure that the keeping quality is at its best. Non-perishable food, on the other hand, have a longer shelf life, and they are also known as dry foods. They are low in moisture and fat content, and they are sometimes sealed in cans and jars. So these would include things such as flour, rice, cornmeal, dried peas and beans, sugar, just to name a few. Now it is important to note that these foods absorb moisture from the air, so they should be stored in airtight containers or sturdy plastic bags in a cool, dry area such as a cupboard. And then finally, we have semi-perishable foods. So these are foods with low water content and dry foods that may contain some amount of fat. So examples of these would include butter, margarine, cooking fats and oils, biscuits, nuts, hard cheeses, vegetables such as onions and potatoes. Now, some of these foods may require refrigeration. Note also that refrigeration of starchy fruits, roots, and vegetables are not necessary. They just need to be stored in a cool room. We've made it to the end of another lesson. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to leave a like, drop a comment below, subscribe, and share this video with anyone who may find it useful.